For what purpose does the gentleman from Idaho rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
An amendment offered by Mr. Otter of Idaho.
This amendment would prohibit any funds from being used to carry out Section 213 of the U.S. Patriot Act as signed into law on October 26, 2001. Through the passage of this amendment, Americans would have reinstated a different kind of security, one giving them the renewed confidence of their government in tirelessly protecting their individual freedom from unjustified and unnecessary intrusion.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise? The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remark.
Without objection.
I rise in support of this amendment. I want to compliment the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Otter, for bringing this to the floor. When the Patriot Act was passed, it was in the passions following 9/11, and that bill should have never been passed. It was brought up carelessly, casually, in a rapid manner. The bill that had been discussed in the Judiciary Committee was removed during the night before we voted. The full text of this bill was very difficult to find. I'm convinced that very few members were able to really review this bill before voting. That bill should have never passed. We certainly should continue to maintain the sunset provisions, but that's a long way off, and we should be starting to reform and improve this particular piece of legislation. This is our first chance to do so. I've had many members in the Congress come to me and on the quiet admit to me that voting for the Patriot Act was the worst bill and the worst vote they've ever cast. And this will give them an opportunity. Although this is very narrow, it's just too bad we couldn't have made this more broad. And it's too bad that we were not going to get to vote on Mr. Sanders' amendment to make sure that without the proper search warrant that the federal government wouldn't have access to the library records. But there is no need ever to sacrifice liberty in order to maintain security. I feel more secure when I have more liberty, and that's why I'm a defender of liberty, because my main concern is security, both in the physical sense as well as the financial sense. I think the freer the country is, the more prosperous we are. And the freer the country is, the more secure we are. And yet it was in the atmosphere of post 9/11 that so many were so anxious to respond to what they perceived as demands by the people to do something. But just to do something, if you're doing the wrong thing, what good is it? You're doing more harm. But my main argument is that there is never a need to sacrifice liberty in order to protect liberty. And that is why we would like to at least remove this clause in here that allows sneak and peek search warrants. It took hundreds, if not thousands of years to develop this concept that governments do not have the right to break in without the proper procedures. And there has to be probable cause. And yet we threw that out the window in this post 9/11 atmosphere. And we gave away a lot. Yes, we talk in the numbers of dozens of examples of times when our government has used this and abused it. But that's only the beginning. It's the principle. If they had only done it once, if they had not done it, this should be still taken care of. Because as time goes on, and if we adapt to this process, it will be used more and more, and that is throwing away a big and important chunk of our Constitution, the Fourth Amendment. Not only should we do whatever we can to reform that legislation, but we already know that there's a Patriot Act number 2. It hasn't been given us to the Congress, but the administration has it out there. It's available, but we only get to see it from the internet. So in that bill, there's a proposal that the government can strip us of our citizenship. And then anybody then stripped of their citizenship could be put into the situation that many foreigners find themselves in Guantanamo. So I see this as a very, very important issue. If anybody cares about liberty, if anybody cares about personal freedom and the rule of law and the need for probable cause before our government comes barging into our houses, and it has been under the guise of drug laws that have in the past instituted many of these things, but this is much worse. This has been put into an explicit piece of legislation, and the American people in this Congress ought to become very alert to this and how serious this piece of legislation is. I hope that the Congress and our colleagues here will support this amendment. It is very necessary, and it will be voting the Constitution, and it will be voting for liberty if we support this amendment.
Gentleman,
Mr. Chairman,
it's back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin rise?
to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to congratulate the gentleman from Texas who just spoke. It's a cliche in this House that almost no speeches change people's minds. But I think this speech is one occasion when it has certainly changed mine. And I want to thank the gentleman for that. I originally was...
Gentleman's time's expired. Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Otter. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman from
on that I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Otter, will be postponed.